Hey, everybody, welcome back to our next lesson here in the biblical narrative. This time around, we are going to speak about the story of Noah and the flood. Now, this is actually a fairly lengthy story, takes up several chapters in the book of Genesis. We are not going to hit all of it because just in the interest of time, there's a lot of information in there, and it's quite a bit. So basically, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 6 and Genesis chapter 9, and we'll kind of talk about the stuff in the meantime. First thing I'm going to have you do is our time of check-ins with one another and the opening prayer. So I'm going to do the whole share screen thing here. We're going to pull this up, hit share. You can see right here, we've got our opening prayer. So I want you to put me on pause here with your families and say the prayer together. Talk about your highs and lows. What's been going good this week, what's maybe not been going so great this week, and then then hit play again, and we will continue. So pause, and then we'll continue. Okay, gonna trust that you did that, and now we're coming on back again. So now through that, we are going to, oh, I got to zip up here. Sorry, I'm in the wrong spot. There we go. All right. So last time when we left off at the end of our last story, we had not only a story of the fall with Adam and Eve when they disobeyed God and ate the forbidden fruit, and then were cast out of the garden. We also saw how that carried over into the next generations with their children, specifically with Cain and Abel. Now we are zipping ahead. We are fast forwarding, and we're going ahead about a chapter and about 10 generations. And they are all listed in Genesis chapter 5. If you want, you can put me on pause and you can look at that real quick. We see in this amount of time, or in this span of time, this little bit of genealogical information, that people seem to live for a really, really, really long time, like Yoda old. When 900 years old you reach, look as good you will not. Sorry, I like Yoda, it's funny. So we see that things are going on. Now, there's always the question comes up is why did the people live so long? Folks, I don't know. Maybe their understanding of time was different. Maybe God let them live for a really long time because there were fewer people and they needed to live a long time to populate a lot and have large families. I don't know exactly why, but that's what we hear. So that's kind of what we're skipping over in this point. And as we're getting ready to pick up today, last thing I want you to think about is this question of remember what God's first instruction was to humanity. And this is going all the way back to creation. And I'm not talking about don't eat the apple, but what was the first thing that God told humanity? Remember, it was God said, be fruitful and multiply. So based on this genealogical information and the fact that we've got multiple generations happening, it seems that things are off to a good start, then things are on track. Or are they? Dun, 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 dun. Okay, so I'm going to take us back off screen share now and get back just to me normal here again. All right, so first thing I'm going to want to do, we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 6, and specifically verses 5 through 7. So in just a second, I'm going to have you put me on pause. Go ahead and read that together. And or in fact, go ahead and do that. Put me on pause. Okay, now you've read it. Things have gone kind of haywire. Now, remember last time we sort of talked about that idea that people are neither entirely good and entirely bad. We're kind of a mixture, right? We're kind of both. We've got the capability of being good and we've got the capability of being bad all at the same time, and we're all very complex creatures. But it kind of seems like at this point, based on these initial couple of verses, that things are really leaning towards the not so good, aren't they? Okay, question for you. Based on 5 through 7, how does God feel about creation and humanity at this point? And I want you to record that, write that down. Okay, now having done that, I want you to read together verses 8 through 10. Okay, now having done that, we see that there is an exception. That God's not real happy with humanity, but there is an exception, and that's Noah and by proxy, his sons along with him. Okay, now we're going to read verses 11 through 13. So put me on pause and read that. Okay, we got a lot of pausing and reading today, don't we? It's okay, we'll keep up with it. During this portion, we hear that the earth is also corrupted. It's not just humanity, but it's the earth that's corrupted along with it. Now, remember last time when we talked about in the fall about how the disobedience affected not only the individuals, but also the world and those that were around them. So that we see this effect of disobedience kind of radiating out, and that seems to be what's been going on now for generations at this point. All right, so here's the next question. I'm going to want you to write this down and record it as well. What does God have planned? Okay, so we know that. You can probably figure that the flood is what God has planned. Now, I want you to talk in your families. I want you to talk and record this together. What do you know, sort of generically speaking, about the story of the flood? What happens? I want you to write that down. And once you've got that written down, I mean, don't worry about going crazy with the details, but once you've got that written down, then then resume this again. So put me on pause, but then you'll resume it and I'll kind of talk over it. Okay. So now that you've talked about it, this is kind of how I think about it. God tells Noah, hey, I'm going to flood the earth, build an ark. Noah does it. Takes a really long time. Takes like 100 years, some people say. And Noah's no spring chicken at this point. When the story picks up, he's like 500 years old. So he's already been around for a long time. Takes a really long time to build the ark. And the ark is roughly the size of a football field, roughly. Now, as he's doing that, or as it finishes up, God sends all the animals to Noah in pairs. They all start to show up, and then it starts to rain. So then Noah and his family and all the animals, they go on the ark. God shuts the door. It keeps on raining. It keeps raining. It keeps raining. It keeps raining. Things flood. Everything floods. Even the mountains are covered. The earth is completely covered. Everyone dies. Animals all die, except for those who are on the ark. Now, they're bouncing around. We tend to think, how long does the flood last? We usually say 40 days. 40 days. That is based on how long the rain itself lasts, but the flood itself lasts an entire year. If we look into the whole thing, a year and like 2 chapters worth of Genesis, but they're floating around for a really, really, really long time before the water finally subsides. So, but finally the water goes away. And with that, I want you now to skip ahead a couple of chapters, and we're going to pick up at Genesis chapter 9, verses 7 through 11. So now put me on pause. Go ahead and read that part. Okay. So now we hear that God has been talking to Noah and his family after the flood. Now, what is God's command here? And have we heard it before? We have, right? Where have we heard that before? Think about it. Be fruitful and multiply. It's that same thing we talked about at the beginning, right? Like it was God's first command to humanity. So now that God's giving it again to Noah, and like everybody else seems to be dead, it seems to be that God is kind of starting over with Noah again, not completely erasing the slate and completely starting from scratch, but basically starting with humanity again with the same command: be fruitful and multiply. But what's different this time that we did not have previously in the creation story? Did you pick up on it? It's this promise that God makes, and also the whole when God says, I'm going to start over with you. So I want you to keep that idea in mind. I'm going to start things over with you because, hint, foreshadowing, that's something we're going to bump into again in the future. Alrighty, now here's another spot where I'm going to want you to pause, and I've got a question. I want you to talk about this together, record it, and then come back. Here's the question. Have you heard the word covenant? Have you heard this before? And what do you think it means? Talk about that together, write down your answer, and then resume. Okay. So a covenant, when I think of a covenant, I think of it as like it's a promise, or sometimes I almost think of it like a contract that's made between two people. And in this one, the covenant this time, post-flood, God is promising or making a covenant to never destroy the earth by flood again. God also gives us a sign. You maybe know what it is, but I want you to read verses 12 and 13 now. Okay, so what's the sign? It's the rainbow, right? Now, I want you to read verses 14 through 17. Go ahead. All right, here's the question. Is the promise, or I should say, is the sign, the rainbow, is the sign for us or is it for God? What do you think? I think it's a sign for us, but the one who sees it and remembers is God. And what does God remember? God remembers the promise to never destroy the earth by flood again. Now, this is not to say that floods don't happen. Lord knows we have our share of floods. We had a big one about a year ago here in or a year or two ago here in our part of the world. So floods still happen, but the promise that God makes is never to destroy the earth in its entirety by flood again. Now, the interesting thing about this particular covenant is completely one-sided. Usually when we think about a covenant, this person brings something to the table and this person brings something to the table, and they meet in the middle. They each agree to something. In this one, completely one-sided. God says, I will remember my promise, and nothing is asked of humanity at this point. So it seems to me in this story, what we have seen go on is that God is cleansing the earth, realizing that humanity and the earth is still flawed. It is still broken. It is both good and not so good. And God seems to realize and recognize that we need boundaries because of this. But I think God also realizes the ongoing need for grace and forgiveness for broken humanity, broken reality. And with this covenant, what we see right now at this point is that God seems to be accepting that as acceptable, accepting it as acceptable. God seems to accept this present reality for the moment. Foreshadowing. We're not going to end there. Okay. I want to get into the aftermath now. In just a second, I'm going to want you to read verses 18 through 28. This one's a little bit longer. And here's a couple of questions. Is humanity now perfect? And what do we learn about Noah in this portion? Okay, so put me on pause, read it, and answer those questions and write those down. Okay, so we see Noah's still not perfect. And we see that he's the one who God has chosen. So God chooses and uses imperfect people. Despite not being perfect, God still chooses these people. Now, does that seem significant? And does that seem like something that maybe we would zero in on? And like we even talked about a little bit last time, and we're going to continue to talk about it? The answer is yes, it is significant. And we'll continue to see that. We'll keep bumping into that. Okay, so that's pretty much what's going to go on. And now in a little bit of wrap up, here's a little bit of an extra way to think about this. We've got this story from the scriptures, and it's an important one. I think it teaches us a lot of stuff. However, this is not the only flood story from ancient cultures. There are many different ancient cultures that have similar types of stories, and we would call those myths. Now, if you recall, we kind of talked about this before. A myth is something that reveals a truth. It teaches us something regardless of if it is a factual event or not. Now, as I say that, I'm not saying that the flood really happened or didn't really happen. I'm simply saying and proposing that in this story, like many of the other stories, we are taught something about the relationship between God and humanity. So what I want you to do now in this closing question, and I want you to record this and include this as well. What do you think overall this story is teaching us about the relationship between God and humanity? So go ahead and fill that out. Get me the information back, get that sent in. Any questions that you have along with it, those questions that you've been sending have been great. So get those sent in to me and we will respond to them next week. Thanks, everybody.